Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Warren Doctor here from the East Tennessee Historical Society. Sorry about that delay. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank every one of you for coming to listen to our virtual brown bag lectures. We're very excited to have these up and running again because there's such amazing content that we want to be able to share with you. As you'll probably have seen, we're going to record this so that we can put it on YouTube videos later. Let me say that again. We're going to record this so that we can be putting this on YouTube later so we can share it with our affiliates out in the community. And we're very, very excited that this project is up and running again. And a couple things I'm going to do before we get into this evening or this afternoon's lecture is, first of all, plug the next lecture, which will be on the 16th of June at 11 a.m. And it will be Anthony Fletcher and Natalia Dorfield, and they'll be talking about the African-American experience in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So we're very excited about that. And the other thing that I would like to do is, of course, it would be remiss if I didn't say, if you're not members, you should join the East Tennessee Historical Society. We would love to have you to join and to come listen and participate and perhaps even share your own views in programs such as this. Of course, it's your continued support that allows us to bring you this sort of programming. So we're very excited about that. Without further ado, I'm very excited to be bringing you Tate Greene's presentation, which is Stories Matter, My Journey About Loving History. And I can say this, that Tate's something of a celebrity around our office. He is an award-winning documentarian, although he asked me not to call him that. He's a high school senior, and he currently lives on a family farm in southeast Knoxville, and he's very passionate about Appalachian history and cultural history of the region. And I'm very excited that he's here, and I very much look forward to hearing him speak. I've not had a chance yet to watch his award-winning stuff. He's also a huge player in National History Day. I should mention that. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Tate Greene, and I just want to thank everyone again for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words. And Dr. Doctor and I have not had the pleasure of meeting in person yet, but if you don't follow him on social media, I recommend it. He has some really good stuff. I want to thank the Historical Society for this event. It's an honor to be here, and it's always an honor to work with the Historical Society. I just think it is such a huge resource here in our community to have our own historical society nearby and always ready for us to use. So I really want to start from how I got started with National History Day and with the Historical Society and history in general. The history of my journey with history so far. History has always kind of been there for me in one way or another. I can't say that from a young age I was ever super interested in studying history or writing about it, but there were books and I had my imagination, and growing up on our family farm with lots of woods nearby, there were plenty of times to kind of, I think it's I can't remember who wrote Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold. He has this concept of nature, that there's this idea of Daniel Booning out in the woods, reenacting these historical attributes of American history and landscape and all of those things. And so I had a lot of opportunities to Daniel Boone out in the woods and make things with sticks and all sorts of that. And so I really think that played a large role in my interest in history. So I really got started in the 6th grade from a more academic standpoint when my teacher, still one of my favorite teachers to this day, Miss Shugart, she introduced us to the National History Day program. She told us that we could choose what type of project we wanted to make with National History Day. You have boards, you have documentaries, you have papers, performances, all of these different types of presentations. But then the real thing for me was that you got to pick what your topic was going to be about. Students are rarely ever asked what it is that they want to be included in the curriculum. And so in this case, I got to choose. I ended up choosing Sir Edmund Hillary. He was the first man to summit Mount Everest with his Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. And that was kind of a family connection. My dad had done a lot of work with his son. And so there was a really great interview there that everything was built around. And I think, and this will be clear a little bit later in the presentation, that personal element is really what has driven my interest in history. And doing that project the first year, I showed up to regionals, not really sure what to expect, and I ended up getting second. And that was the first time I'd ever won anything. I hadn't done any competitions. I didn't, run or do lots of sports or anything that I'd ever really gotten a medal for before, unless you count Pinewood Derby. But that was a really enjoyable experience because it added sort of that external motivation to it as well. And so my early kind of experiences with NHG were very much focused on creating a great documentary that would win and do these things. And so I went to the state level and was successful there. I went to the nationals and my eyes were opened to the amazing work that so many young people are doing, especially through National History Day. And to think about all the states that support National History Day and all the schools and all the teachers and students, that's just a huge resource for anyone interested in history. The next year, I did a project on Ansel Adams, who was a really famous photographer of the outdoors. And that project, I kind of stumbled a little bit more. I relied a little bit more on established historical thought, historical ideas, and writing about him. And I really enjoyed the project because I loved the images and I loved the story. And I got some great interviews with that. But I ended up stopping at the state level with that one. I think in 8th grade, that's when I really started transitioning to local history. I had emailed Dan McDonald. He and I had spoken on the earlier project of Ansel Adams because he was great friends with Ansel's photographic assistant. And so Mr. McDonald and I have exchanged very long emails in the past. And so I kind of asked him, what are some unique East Tennessee history topics that are local and I can really dive into? And he suggested the East Tennessee bridge burners. And since then, it has just gotten more local and more close to home. And I'd never heard of the East Tennessee bridge burners. In fact, the fact that they were a Civil War story, I wasn't really interested in that. I didn't love the Civil War. It was, to me, it was pretty boring. It was like, okay, well, you've got two sides that are Americans. There's not much difference there. There's not a lot of nuance. I thought these are all places that, you could drive to. That seems kind of lame. But really quickly, my concept of that was totally shifted. I found out that my teacher at the time, Ms. Shugart, she was a descendant of one of the East Tennessee bridge burners families, the Harmons. And that really kind of clicked something there. It's like, this is really cool. My teacher is attached to this. And as I began researching and getting involved with it, I realized that, I have no information genealogically that I have any relation to the bridge burners. But I began to feel this kind of kinship there with them, that these are people from my place, from, my home region. They see, they obviously, we live a little bit removed from that area, but in one sense, it is something that's very local, very close to home. And especially having the archives here in Knoxville, it means that it is there. It is very close to home. And so for me, the real big factor that I enjoyed about that project was having the archives. My mom and I would go in and reserve our table in the McClung collection, and we would, max out our number of copies that we could get from an item. We would go into the microfiche rooms and read through old newspapers, Parson Brownlow's Whig, and a lot of those interesting resources. And when it wasn't presented to me in a history book, because there were very few, there's a few books that are really closely related to that, but not a lot. It was hard to find that in a lot of places, like you would find with Sir Edmund Hillary or Ansel Adams, these very big names. But, the East Tennessee bridge burners are pretty famous here, but, in the classroom, I'd never been taught about the bridge burners. Even today, I've never had a class that we have discussed the bridge burners unless I was the one who brought it up, much to probably my teacher's chagrin at the time. But that topic, it really changed how I looked at it, because suddenly I was becoming an expert on something that was local, close to home, relevant, and I could become an expert on because I had the resources here in my community to become an expert on them. Now, I'm not an expert. I would say Don Bible, who, his scholarship in that topic is just amazing. And he really inspired me because he's someone who has just taken a passion for it. And he shared with me some of his other work that wasn't just, bridge burners, that kind of extended into, I think, World War II specifically. And that's just really fascinating to see someone in the community doing research, even if it's not community related necessarily, but finding those connections and being interested in that. And that project also influenced kind of my process. My biggest thank you has to be to Lisa Oakley, who has just been a constant source of advice, critique, brainstorming, so many different things. We've talked about our meetings. Whenever someone else, I've worked with a few different partners, whenever somebody comes into a meeting with me and Lisa, I think it's kind of a little bit like organized chaos. Lisa and I both kind of know what's going on, and sometimes she'll stop and ask me like, oh, is this too much? And I always enjoy hearing what she has to say, and just that cumulative knowledge. And that's something that I've recognized that I'm hoping to build in the coming years, is there is just this knowledge. I mean, people who are involved with our historical society, especially the leaders of the historical society, really know so much. I mean, there's so many stories that get lost that you can't find in books, you can't find as easily in directories. And so you've got to really dig for it. And that's why, people really matter. The people of the historical society, the people who run the archives, the archivists, all of those people, they know stories that we don't. Just as, you look at like the Foxfire program, going into the mountains and finding people who know these things. I mean, that's such a huge resource. And so I began to, when working with people who knew about it, I began to see myself in the place. And so history lost kind of this, there was no longer this black and white patina, this kind of this sepia view of history. It very much became, it had color, it had life, it had voice. Reading the letters of the bridge burners, it became so human. And I think that's deeply what still interests me, especially with history, is that, it's a social science. It's all about humans and how we live. And that's why I'm really interested in social history, because I love thinking about putting myself in someone's shoes 100 years ago. And I just think that if we as people can put ourselves in the shoes of someone 100 years ago, then we can think about what we want our country and our communities to look like 100 years from now, and how people will look at us. And, we don't want to get, paralysis by analysis, but I think it's very helpful. It makes us more insightful and more thoughtful humans when we think about the past, the present, and the future. And it makes it very easy to sympathize and empathize with people. I think the big transition from that project was kind of more into the area of Appalachian history. So Dr. Aaron Astor at Maryville College, he introduced me with a few words. He talked about the East Tennessee identity, what it means to be an East Tennessean. And for a while, I had this concept of, I wanted to get out, as soon as I possibly could. I wanted to go somewhere more interesting, air quotes, somewhere like where the Revolutionary War happened, where those battlefields are, which that does not discount Tennessee at all. But, go somewhere with really interesting stuff that had happened. But when you start talking about identity and place, especially in the context of history, you really make it so much more personal. You own it. You own part of it. Finding identity in history, region, and place, those things are incredibly important to us. And I think if you look at the tradition of writing and literature around, the Appalachian region, place is just such a significant part. And to me, that's really been a huge development over the last few years. I participated in Youth Leadership Knoxville, and, had a totally new vision of what the place of Knoxville looks like, who the people of Knoxville are. And through history, I've come to understand the region better and my own family better. How, the parts that are in Eastern Kentucky, the parts that are in East Tennessee, understanding that better and having a real pride in it. And pride in like a understanding that in many ways, we are the heirs of this historical tradition. And I think when we become heirs, we have a reason to conserve and a reason to be responsible, because we have to hold that legacy and make sure that it represents and reflects what we want it to. The next year, my freshman year, I I worked with, I see Miss Cobb is on here. I worked with Linda Cobb's son, John D., who's now off at Columbia. He and I did a project on Cades Cove and how it interacted with the foundation of the national park. I've been visiting the national park kind of my whole life. And there's this, easy tendency to look at it as the park is conserving the natural beauty, but there's also, an inherent necessity that they conserve the historical and cultural legacy there too. And so with that, I kind of started thinking about what Appalachia was. How do we begin to define it? I interviewed Loyal Jones, who's worked up at Berea, and he's an amazing man, an amazing scholar. And talking to him, he wrote Appalachian Values and then updated it later and kind of had these things. And so I really started thinking, what is Appalachia? Who is Appalachia? What does that look like? How do you define it? I mean, it's hard to define. I think another thing with that project is John D. really pushed me to think more archivally. I'd worked in archives and I'd used resources, but for him, the process was going in and diving deep, really looking. I mean, I think we spent like way too much time reading an internal publication of a logging company in Western North Carolina. And it played no part whatsoever really in our later iterations of the documentary. But what it did is it helped me understand that there's this, sometimes you just got to jump in and be surprised by what you find. You can't have a thesis and say, I want to prove this. You've got to go in and you've got to collect first, and you've got to really submerge yourself. And so that's when I started thinking deeply and just kind of sitting in it and taking it all in. And then the second stage of that was thinking about how we present it, how we preserve and present it. I'm going to drink a water really quick. My throat's getting dry. So how do we preserve and present history? And that's where it can get kind of controversial. Whose view do we look through with that project? It'd be very easy to get very anti-national park very quickly. I mean, you think about somebody losing their home because of it, being pushed off. Some people weren't allowed to keep the boards that were their houses. They were burned or disposed of. I mean, it's sad to think, and there's a quote from an oral history. I think if the people would have gotten to keep their land up there would have been so many happy memories. And so it's hard to deal with those things. So it would have been very easy to go that route. But also the national park, I mean, you think about what that's done for the economy, for the community, for the natural environment. When we interviewed Senator Lamar Alexander, he said, I think if they hadn't built a national park, we'd find a big water slide up in Cades Cove or some really big apartments or cabins, and it would kind of despoil the land. And so there's this conflict there, like who's right, who's wrong. And I think that's what I really enjoyed. And there was my favorite compliment. I think we ended up 5th in the nation at NHD. And my favorite compliment from a judge was that they left the documentary totally confused. I mean, who was right, who was wrong? I mean, I think that it really changed that history is not black and white in the sense that it's not just old pictures, but it's also not right and wrong. When we start talking about narratives of right and wrong, it gets very easy to get a little stuck in our perspective. And so that was a really interesting project, and it changed how I saw it. During that project, Lisa pointed to the Appalachian Film Workshop, known as Apple Shop. And I spent so many hours watching those documentaries and getting interested in it. And that really influenced my next project. And that was about Eula Hall. And I worked with a partner, Shelby McNeil, who's a junior at CBA. And we had a really interesting time with that project. It really began, I was interested in the war on poverty in Appalachia, looking at, how my original interest actually was Robert F. Kennedy. I'm a huge fan of Bobby Kennedy and his story. So I was looking at that and looking at the region, and there were these poverty tours and all of this stuff within Appalachia. And so I stumbled across an article that mentioned this amazing woman, Eula Hall, who had a clinic and was in charge of a water board and had worked to secure welfare rights for people. And I was really fascinated by this person that I'd never heard of. And you would think, this is somebody that should be in the famous Kentuckians list. And she's from Floyd County, Kentucky. And so I called the clinic and said, can I talk to Miss Eula Hall? She was still living at the time. And I got an interview with her, and we drove up and we interviewed her. And she just had so much amazing wisdom. And that really personified history. Like, here is why we should want to preserve and study history. And so that interview to me is some small contribution to, the scholarship of the area. It's like, here's an interview. This is probably would have been the last. I mean, she passed away, sadly, this month, May 8th, actually. And that's a real loss to the community. And so our interview was probably one of the last few interviews, even though that was a couple years ago. And that project, there were no archives dedicated to her. All of her papers, there was no archive there. There was a book that had been written about her, and there was a short documentary from Appalachia about her clinic after it burned down the first time, and her building it back up. So we had to really scramble around and look for stuff. We had to rely pretty heavily on interviews, and we had to look at any documents we could find from the War on Poverty, the Vista workers, oral histories. We made it to Berea College and found a set of pictures that no one had found before. When Miss Hall had seen it, they didn't know that those pictures exist from the Warren Brunner collection. And I think actually that when we showed Miss Hall the documentary after Nationals, when we placed second in the nation, she was really excited about that, because one of the nurses who was pictured in there had just passed away a few days ago, and that was shown at his memorial service, which is a real honor, because then though it might be easy to see it as a piece of advocacy and less history, I do think that there is a benefit to history that is telling a story that is kind of particular. We don't want to get too black and white with right and wrong, but that narrative of her was really amazing. And so we began to feel through that project that we were doing something more than a National History Day project, that we felt like we were honoring her legacy. And when we got to go to finals, it was like, yes, this is so exciting. We're going on and we have a good chance here, but it was also, that's a room full of people. That's more people who get to know who Eula Hall is and get to be inspired by her and all of those things. And so when we ended up winning, it was like, wow, like, it's really nice that we won and all of this stuff, but it meant the most that we were able to honor her in that way. And that might sound overly sentimental and probably not removed historian mindset. But I do think something I'd like to talk about is, what about projects and presentations of history that don't pretend to be balanced? I mean, fair and balanced is important, but I think about, there was a really great documentary recently made about Night Comes to the Cumberland and its original publication. And someone said, Harry Caudell, he made no pretense to be fair and balanced. He was not fair and balanced. He knew what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. So I think there's this interesting idea of projects that come with a point. Here's a historical argument we're going to make. And maybe that's not obvious just because I haven't been through many years of education, but I think seeing history is not just, here's a list of facts, here are some interesting things, here's stuff that happened, let's see both sides, as much as presentations of history that are narratives, that are advocacies for people and for ideas and events. And let me convince you why this is important, not, well, but it also played no role. And so obviously you have to be fair and balanced, but I think that's a very interesting idea, an interesting concept. My last project that I did was about the Appalachian Film Workshop, or Apple Shop. That project I see as a real culmination. I originally started doing a project on the snail darter and how it affected legislation with endangered species. And that just really wasn't grabbing me. I wasn't super grabbed by it. It didn't take my mind somewhere. And I was working with Lisa at the time through through a school internship, and I was working with her, and she recommended looking at Apple Shop and thinking about it. And my project very quickly became a project about communication. And that was this past year's theme, which I didn't participate in. It always seems like whenever you pick a topic, it'd be great the next year, or would have been great the last year, in its relevance to the theme. But this documentary, it relied very heavily on primary sources and interviews. I was talking to Dr. Chris Greene at Berea College, and one of his comments about it, he said, what's fascinating about it is that you have all of these voices that are woven together, so that even though, you know, my voice was the narrator's voice, it was very much the voice of people. And I think that's what history could really use, is being the voice of people, and that's where you get more fair and balanced. When you ask lots of people what their opinions are, and you use lots of resource, you have this balance, but you don't lose the voices. You don't lose the people who are advocating for something, or have an idea, or have a belief, because hearing those beliefs is important. I think that story especially was a really great culminating, you know, aspect, because it was about sense of place. You know, the Appalachian Film Workshop has been hugely involved in helping people understand why Appalachia matters, why you don't have to leave home to make important contributions, or to be important, and to feel those things. Just the whole project in general really fascinated me, and that's something that has always, it would interest me to continue working on that forever, because there's so much that can be done with Appalshop. Their work, I mean, interviewing Herbie Smith, who's a filmmaker there, he talks about, you know, once he had a camera in his hand, he understood the place so much differently than he did before. And I think that that's something that Historical Society and National History Day has a real chance to do with students. I think that Appalshop and National History are very similar in a lot of ways, because you're putting the power of the project and the power of historical research and argumentation in the hands of the students. And it's their job to decide what it is that they're interested in, what arguments they're going to make, what sources they'll consult. And that's a really amazing thing. And it's liberating, it's empowering. And I think making history more accessible to everyone is something that's going to empower everyone, especially our communities. When our communities have access to their history, and they can discuss the diversity of it and argue over it, that really enriches the community and enriches the understanding that we have of ourselves and our place. One of my really enriching experiences was this past fall taking Appalachian Literature from Pellissippi State Community College. It was Dr. Charles White was the instructor, and we read a series of books. I wasn't able to remember all of them as I was writing these down. I have to go deep into my bookshelves, but Storming Heaven, Lost Mountain, Birds of Opulence, and several pieces of poetry by Jesse Graves, all, you know, Appalachian literature. And discussing those, especially with other students. I mean, this was an asynchronous class, so there were a lot of people from the area, but there were several from Denver and, you know, out in kind of random places, at least when you're thinking about Knoxville. And reading those and discussing those with other people was really interesting too, because you see that, you know, I've consulted some scholarship on Appalachia and read a lot of that, but, you know, there's a diversity of viewpoints. Whether you're an expert who has read, you know, everything there is to read in Appalachian literature, or someone who's only read, you know, one or two books, hearing that voice, hearing the diversity of voices is important. And in my own time, I've been reading a lot of Appalachian literature. James Agee is a real favorite. I've read that one I read A Death in the Family 2 or 3 times, and I enjoy it every time. I've started reading a lot of Wendell Berry. Silas House is one of my favorite authors. Wilma Dykeman, Gertie Norman. I had a great chance to meet Dr. Elizabeth Catt when she came to do a lecture here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. Dr. Meredith McCarroll edited Appalachian Reckoning. Those are some really amazing works that introduce you to all of those things. My final thing before we can open up for questions is kind of talk about my future and my plans. I'm going to be starting at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire in the fall. I don't declare a major till sophomore year, but I can guarantee you that my major will include history somehow. Right now, I'm planning on double majoring in history and geography, potentially adding a minor in film. What really excites me about those is I love looking at the course descriptions. I just think it's such an exciting thing to do. Today, I was actually reading about sociolinguistics. And so I'd have to take linguistics 1 before I could take that one, but sociolinguistics, how class and race and gender and even historical position, affects language and development of language. And I think that's really fascinating. But I'm excited to take lots of different classes, whether they're in history. I'm doing a senior thesis. And I can almost guarantee that my senior thesis will be in Appalachian or regional history. I'm really excited because I think now is really a great time for historians. If you look at the data, the number of majors in history has been declining, and the number of positions for history majors and people with PhDs in history has been declining as well. Doesn't seem like a great time to be a historian, but it is, because as I've listened to podcasts or listened to the news, the number of times I've heard them bring a historian on is really huge, because it's part of the cultural discussion. We talk about legal precedent and something like this has never happened before. This is the first time this has happened. Or, are Americans more divided now, or were they more divided then? And I think that's so cool that we have historians making serious contributions to cultural discussions. Especially when we start talking about, race, religion, and government. I think that's a place that when we ask historians about it, that's really great, because historians have so much to say and there's so much more to learn. I also think we're at a time where we can start re-examining old stories and finding the ones that slip through the cracks. I think a new generation of historians is on their way to do a lot of that work, to say, okay, well, we've talked about it this way forever. What if we talk about it a different way? Or what if we ask someone else? What if we read someone else's account of this event and really try to change the narrative? I think documentaries are really great because they make that accessible to almost anyone. Anyone can sit down and watch a 10-minute documentary. And I would love to make hour-long documentaries. I think there are some topics that it would have been so much easier to make an hour-long documentary than 10 minutes. But what 10 minutes forces you to do, and that's the National History Day time limit for documentary, is it's a time that is, somebody can sit down and watch it and not get bored or get lost, but also forces you to distill what's essential. And so you have to ask questions. Is this essential to the argument? Is this not essential? Does this improve it? Does this contextualize it? How can we contextualize it, but also contribute to the argument? I think that's a skill that a lot of us could use. Sometimes, you have Zoom meetings that could have been emails. And so there are plenty of people who could learn to make things a little bit more concise, myself included, as I think I'm going on about 32 minutes now. But really, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in re-examining stories and being part of the cultural conversation. As I think about future specific things I want to do, I know that I'm very interested in grad school and teaching, whatever level that's at. But I also think and this is a very youthful idealism that I say this in, but starting film workshops, being a part of giving people cameras and the ability to start telling stories, starting local archives. I think about a community that doesn't have its own archives is kind of raw because everything's kind of disorganized. And if I were to go into library science, that would definitely be what I want to do is work with archives. And then I think about writing and filmmaking, those kinds of things, is telling stories and making sure that people's voices are heard. I don't always like my voice to be at the front of the narrative, as I'm about to graduate tomorrow, actually. And we've had lots of events that are honoring seniors and those types of things. And I always feel a little bit not quite at ease in those. And it's nice today to be behind a computer screen because I don't necessarily have to stand up in front of everyone. But I think taking stories and weaving them together, and showing how we have similarities, showing how we have differences, all of those things that might sound very idealistic, but I think history is the place for all of that. I think history is a place for discussion around so many events. And if we can contextualize things and understand them better, then we can have conversations that are much better informed, and conversations that are, I think, more beneficial to all of us. So, I mean, as you all have proven, you're interested in history by showing up today. I hope that, you know, we can continue to get more and more people interested and kind of stop the trend of reducing the number of history majors. So I'm really grateful for all of you coming today, and I'd love to do some questions. I don't know if Lisa, if you'll be leading that, or
Yes,
whoever will.
I will. And Tate, that was, I appreciate it so much. We, as he said, we've enjoyed years of great conversation and discussion, and we always have to kind of prepare if there's a team member involved in the History Day project. It's like, okay, just join in and enjoy the ride. National History Day is an incredible program that we're very fortunate at the Historical Society to be the regional coordinators. And we partner with the University of Tennessee's History Department in sponsoring the competition itself, which we really hope this coming March will be in person. And that's a great way for community members to get involved too, as far as judges. So if you're interested in learning more about History Day, reach out to us at the same email where you registered for today's program, and we can get you more information. But as a part of History Day, you can be involved if you have a student, you know, if there's someone you know in your family, in your community that you think this would be right up their alley. You listen to Tate and you think of this person, then let them know about History Day. They just need a sponsor. Typically that's a teacher, and we'll need to find a teacher to kind of formally sponsor in their school. But Tate's mom and dad, Laura and Todd, have been great sponsors and supporters of him through these years. So it does not have to be any one certain person, but all students that do well with History Day or any of their studies, there's someone in the community that joins in with them on this exploration. So Tate, thank you for sharing today and allowing me to talk a little bit more about History Day, but I do have a couple of questions for you. First, I want you to kind of relive the moment at National History Day when you all were listening for the category to come up, and then play out and tell everybody what your award was, and just kind of recreate for folks what History Day looks like and sounds like and feels like when it's in person at the University of Maryland.
Yeah, so it is, I think we were talking about this last night at the dinner table. And I said, you know, I really hate that, you know, last year was online and we missed the award ceremony, but then I thought, oh my goodness, the award ceremony is a lot. It is a lot to sit through. It's a couple hours, but it's very exciting. It all starts with a parade of states. You know, everyone runs around and has all of their, you know, state t-shirts and symbols and flags and stuff. And it's a lot of fun. When they start announcing categories, time seems to slow down when you get there. And so we ended up winning second place in the senior group documentary category. But it ended up being that they announced all of the individual categories first. So individual paper, individual documentary, website, board, and performance. So 5 categories. And then also special awards. So they announced, you know, the different special awards for particular topics. And so it's a couple hours in, and they just started the group awards, and then they went to the state, like the honorable state awards. And so the top projects from the junior category and senior category from each state. And, you know, it's such an honor to win one of those, but when your category hasn't been announced yet, if you're in the finals, if you win one of those awards, that means you did not win first, second, or third. So as we were listening, we were waiting to see, okay, you know, are we in it? Are we in it? And so all the states, and of course, if you've ever had like an auto select of a state, you know that Tennessee is down at the bottom. And we waited and we waited and we were listening, and there was this huge sigh of relief when we didn't get it, but also kind of not total relief, because that meant that, you know, we might have not gotten either. Well, it finally came around to our category, and, you know, they announced third place first, and they announced second place, and it was just, I was sweating and shaking, and I had so many emotions and energies, but it was just such an honor. And then, you know, you run down this, you know, the stairs of the basketball stadium onto the floor, and you run across to the stage, and it's an amazing opportunity. And I think that situation is great. It's great to get to run down and get a medal, but I think the biggest thing is taking part in the process and the program, and really thinking deeply. And so for us, it was an honor to win, but it felt like a bigger honor that, they had said Eula Hall's name in front of that many people, that maybe a couple people might look it up because it sounds intriguing, and that would mean a lot more to us.
So I have a couple of questions. So thank you for sharing that, because that's such a memorable, it's hard to say in words what it's really like as a great experience for students. And for a lot of students, obviously it can change the direction that their lives take. So one of the questions is, so you talked about Appalachian literature, and wondering if you are familiar with Cormac McCarthy's work, if you've read any of his work, and what your take is on it, especially in the context of your research.
Yeah, so I am currently in a kind of off and on read of Suttree with Cormac McCarthy, and his writing really intrigues me, because I had a great kind of comparison when reading James Agee. Is if you read James Agee's A Death in the Family, at least the originally published version, it starts with summer Knoxville 1915. And you look at all of the words about the beauty and all of these things and the summer evenings in Knoxville. But when you read the introduction or the first few pages of Suttree, it's the exact opposite. So it's flipped. So instead of these beautiful things of like the men and their long necks without the collars, and the sound of the one blue dew, all of these rhythms, you read Suttree and it's the exact opposite. And I'm not experienced enough in kind of my analysis of Suttree, but there was another book that I was kind of read through, and it was I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but he's an Appalachian author, and he wrote some really dark Southern Gothic that takes place in Appalachia. And a Netflix version of it came out, and it's called Devil All the Time, or Devils All the Time, or The Devil All the Time, or something like that. And it depicted some pretty horrifying stuff. Not my favorite, a little bit unsavory, but and that kind of brings up an interesting dialogue of, do we want to present these darker sides, these darker visions? It's not necessarily true. It could be true. It has its truth and its untruth, because it's literature. But it does intrigue me. It's kind of a discussion that's worth having that I haven't totally thought out yet. But do we want to present? We want to present positive images of Appalachia that are diverse and are complex. If you look at the complexity, the first movie I ever watched about somebody from Appalachia was October Sky, about Homer Hickam and building rockets. And I was like, wow, this is somebody from a similar place who was really involved in this. And even at that time, I didn't necessarily identify with being Appalachian or not. But I think that is a good question of, like, when we present our literary wealth of the region, do we present even kind of the darker stuff? From what I've read of Suttree so far, it's very dark. But I think there is a place for that, and I'm not quite the expert on that, but I do love those conversations, and I think that's a big part of it.
And I think that one of the things we often discuss is having those of us that have explored those different aspects of a community, from a community, new to a community, and are working on understanding each other together. Then you can have those discussions, and discussion and communication is the heart of what we do in our work as historians as well. So another question, what unexpected challenges have come up as you have refined your research methodology?
I think that the biggest unexpected thing that I would say is part of the research process is picking the topic. Because I've found that it's almost impossible to pick a topic from the first thing you pick, the first idea you have. It's impossible to do that project. I have started so many projects about Horace Kephart and George Mesa. I think half of my NHD projects have started as projects about Horace Kephart and George Mesa. But as you get into it, that's not that I was not interested in their subject, but they led me to something else. And so I think the unexpected that I really enjoy is that you've got to like play with history. A friend, a good family friend, works in the education department at UT, and is talking about like pedagogy of teaching. So when you teach kids math, you need to let them play with numbers. You want them to play around with it. And when you teach kids, English, you want them to play with words, make up words, play, see the different sounds. I think history, although maybe a little bit later in childhood development, it's a great place for that. Is let kids play with history, have fun with it. Oh, this topic's really cool. I want to talk about this. I want to imagine this. I want to think about and see and touch these artifacts, and then follow that. And so the unexpected thing for me has always been to just have fun with it. Sometimes you don't think of a large history project being, primarily based on fun, but when I'm having fun with it, that's when I really follow the path that I think creates the best project. Because the best project is the one that the student or the author or the director is most passionate about.
Right. So here's a genealogy question. Let me get back to it. What is your experience with genealogy research on those that you've researched in East Tennessee history, or even your family, because I know your family has East Tennessee roots? Have you utilized the National Archives or the Tennessee State Library and Archives to locate people in history through genealogy? And I think that's a good question, because oftentimes people think of history as separate from genealogy. So what's your feeling about that? How do they intersect? And have you utilized genealogy?
Yeah, on a personal level, my genealogical skills are relatively limited. We've done some family genealogical work, but the further back we get, the less good we are at it. But my family we have a big chest up in one of the storage rooms that has all of these old pictures and old documents from our family that's lived here for a long time. As far as genealogy goes, I see it as very similar to the type of history that I'm interested in, because I think genealogy, since I didn't start with genealogy, I don't necessarily know, within the psyche of someone who starts with genealogy, what necessarily is their motivation. But I would imagine that it is to understand and to connect to a place and to people that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. So I think that's the kind of history that we need, is history that is personal. Your personal history, is something, the history of the people who have come before you, whether that's in a very linear path, just you or other families or other people who have connected. I haven't utilized a lot of genealogical resources, but I do know for Don Bible, his project on the bridge burners that is really kind of a lot of the definitive work there was primarily genealogy. It started as a genealogical project because I think his wife is very much connected to one of the bridge burner families. And so that's a place where I think genealogists are historians. And so it's almost kind of, I guess it helps to have two specifying terms, but I think historian encompasses genealogist, documentarian, archivist, anyone who's interested in preserving, collecting, discovering stories. I think stories are genealogy, and so that's something that I'm hoping to get into when I have a little more free time at some point.
And maybe you can find one of your family members that can become the subject of one of your research studies, in the past, to help play out. It can be one of those lenses. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a great question that was asked about genealogy.
Yeah, actually, one little note there. I've been playing around with the idea, and I don't know when I'll get around to it, but a big chunk of my family has worked at the Standard Knitting Mill. And so I would really love to do some sort of history, whether it's a documentary or writing, written or however that takes a shape, but about the Standard Knitting Mill, because I think that especially in Knoxville, that institution has had such a role in so many families' lives. And so to talk to people would be really interesting, and just to get their feelings.
It's a great place to start. File that away. So I guess kind of our final question, and let me just see. And I know that you've really fascinated a lot of folks with your conversation. I just wanted to make sure. And your mom did post that Apple Shop posted the Eula Hall documentary on Facebook. And that is, it's not Apple like an apple you eat, it's APPALSHOP. And you can find that information in the chat. And do you have any of your other documentaries on YouTube?
I do. And I would be happy to, if the Historical Society would like to publish those somehow, I'm happy to send those. Yeah, I have access. All of those are on YouTube. I don't know about the early two, but I don't know that I want to share those too much.
Well, and maybe we can work on having those available then with your permission on our YouTube channel. So we can work on that so folks can go in and see it. And the final question, I guess, for today is, what has surprised you most in your studies? Have you had to adjust your point of view as you encountered facts you didn't expect? And I think you kind of alluded to that. You don't come across saying, this is what I'm going to prove, but maybe give us an example of something that surprised you most and that really adjusted your perspective.
I think for me, I mean, I think it's the revision process. You find those kinds of things. And for each project, there have been different examples of that. With Apple Shop, it was sitting down and Lisa and I talking about, what we're presenting and asking a question like, oh, so you mentioned this, what more is there that? And then I've got the information there and I can tell, oh, this is. Well, why isn't that in the documentary? With Eula Hall, there was an example of, it's often information that we've already taken in. There's always new information that can come into the process, and that can be a big part of it. But a lot of it is we've done this mass amount of research and we're compressing it, and something just seems like it makes sense in your brain. With Eula Hall, we were talking about, we had said something about her being, a strong woman from a young age. Well, I think it was Hannah Rexford who asked us, well, what do you mean by that? What's an example? Well, during World War II, Eula Hall was sent to a canning factory in New York, Pennsylvania, where she started a labor riot over unfair working conditions. And when they called her parents to send her home, her parents didn't have a phone. So she came home and didn't tell anyone and just said that they didn't need her. And so that story then was integrated into the documentary. I think that archival research always has an opportunity to show you something new. We've had projects where, 2 weeks before nationals, we stumble across a piece of footage that we didn't know existed, or some pictures we didn't know existed. And it's like, whoa, that has to be in the project. It's not going to be complete without it. I think the biggest thing is that it's an ongoing process. And so, I have a hard time picking out a specific instance where I was surprised by something new. But when I go back and watch the documentaries today, I think I would have said that differently now. I would say from my perspective, I don't know if that's totally right. That's not totally a fair assessment. That's not, I'm not sure I would want to have that as the main point today. And you also learn of new perspectives as my perspective is opened throughout my educational career. I say, wow, why didn't I investigate that? Why didn't I look at that? And when I look at the first project, I think, wow, there's so much. And I go back and do Stredman Hillary again, I could go from so many different angles and see all of these different things and talk about some really complex and relevant topics. And I think relevancy is important too. And so it's just the process that it's like a continuum. The project, you have to kind of say it's done. But ultimately, if in college I ever get a great prompt, I would love to pull out all of my bibliographies and write a new research paper that is all about this and explore it from a different angle.
Well, Tate, I just want to say it's an honor, and it has been such an honor to be engaged and be a part of this journey. Since I can still remember looking through the door at nationals when you were in 6th grade in front of the judges. I have no idea it was a great privilege to be a part of this journey. I think all of us at here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. So, and I think all of us can say, just hearing you talk about this journey and now how you can look at things and, oh, I wish I'd done that or I'd done that. We know it's in good hands going to Dartmouth. You have great potential, and just stay in touch. Maybe you can come back and do another program for us and bring us up to speed on where you are with Appalachian history in the context of, the region where you are, in school and learning more about there. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for everyone that's joined us, and good luck. Enjoy tomorrow, big festivities with graduation, and good luck, as you start your college career. You have a great heads up on it. So
Thank you.
congratulations. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you on June 16th. We will get more information out on our next brown bag on the African-American experience in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.